Religions of all kinds have something that secular morality doesn't, and that's a proper understanding of secular morality. The truth about morality is that in isolation, it's an almost completely impotent technology because we find it nearly impossible to stick to our moral codes. It's not easy for us to see that morality doesn't work because it does work for things that are local to us, stuff that kind of affects us and is within our field of vision and affects people we love. But beyond that metaphorical locality, we basically don't feel compelled enough to do the right thing. Because doing the right thing would mean boycotting all the companies that we suspect are doing wrong. None of us would probably have a computer, for example, and we would have to never damage the environment with any of our actions. And I doubt anyone listening to this, including me, is managing or even attempting to manage any of that. And it's important to understand, therefore, that through no fault of our own, that's a very clear indication morality is really quite weak on its own. Because over time we've evolved a tremendous capacity for logic and reason, we intellectually signpost what we know we should do but don't feel like doing, and hope that by knowing this, we will be able to follow our own reasoning and do the right thing. And the point of creating these moral codes is to keep us from harm, or to keep the species at large from harm. And so we're confronted with a very simple and very obvious truth that most of science and academia have forgotten, but that religion takes as its central thesis, and that is that morality is an intellectual bridge that we've had to create to make up for a catastrophic lack of accurate emotional signaling, of accurate feeling in the human body that would help us feel compelled to do the right stuff, but that doesn't exist. And what I want to convey in this video is that us not feeling like doing the right thing is a perceptual impairment to the point of extreme disability. And I don't say that lightly, obviously. I'm using that language because it's our number one existential threat on the planet today. Does religion really understand it? Yes, this is the concept of original sin in the Abrahamic religions, and it's a concept of man's total confusion in many of the Eastern religions. That's what they're talking about. The reason for the anatomical lack of wiring that would help us regulate our behavior in an appropriate way to keep us safe is that the emotional signaling has not evolved fast enough to keep pace with the infrastructure of the modern world, because our anatomy can't evolve as quickly as the man-made environment around us is changing. However, we have to operate within the context of this modern world, and so as it gets ever more complicated, and as our bodies stay the same, we become less able to see or feel what we're doing. In nature, animals survive primarily on instinct, and this is because their anatomy is developed in concert with the environment. The way, in part, evolution works is that a mutation is presented to the environment in the form of a genetic variation within an individual animal. If that mutation confers an adaptive advantage, in other words, if it makes the animal feed the environment better and the environment feed the animal better, because that's the handshake that has to exist, then the environment effectively says yes to it. And the animal is more successful, finds more mates, has more children, and the mutation becomes more apparent. It takes hold in the species, and the whole species moves in that direction. Now, if the mutation is destructive, even if it's very subtly destructive in a way that will only become apparent over several generations of that creature, then the animals, along with their environment, are changing together so slowly that every slight adaptation is being safety tested in real time in an analog, unbroken process where the new thing that's emerging is emerging so slowly it's tested by the oceanic forces of every interlocking factor within the symbiotic environment that surrounds it, that it can't emerge if it's destructive. The environment won't allow it to. every emergent property in a species comes about at a slow enough pace for other aspects of the creature's attitudes and behaviors to be whittled away by natural selection, so that the only creatures with this property that survive are ones who have developed appropriate regulatory instincts to make sure the use of it is not damaging to the environment at all. Technology, however, interrupts this dialogue between landscape and animal because it brings about change instantaneously, radically augments our physical power a lot faster than nature does, and it means that things we see in nature that are allowed because they're self-limiting, like violence, which is everywhere in nature, are very dangerous in humanity. Like, there's only so much damage one pair of chimpanzees fighting can do, and it's self-limiting. With humans and technology, that drive behind violence that we have within us can become so massively amplified through tech in a short space of time, it immediately becomes an existential threat from the moment we create the first tool. And it's a bigger threat if we don't understand what's going on. As new technologies come about and change society, we don't predict the potential problems with them because our emotional numbness towards them fools us into believing we must be fine with them. And this is crucial to understand, that we think we operate intellectually, but really we're still animals that operate emotionally. And if you feel nothing about something, you can't help but believe that's because it's not that important. So, and I want to point out, this is the nature of our perceptual impairment. It makes it invisible to us. It's impossible to see because we really trust our emotion to inform us about things as they are. And again, it's that problem that the emotions do work for things that are local to us. So we see it as a technology, well, a biological technology in the case of emotion, that works because it works for everything we see. But it doesn't work for things we don't see because we evolved for it to operate with things that we interact with, but we didn't evolve for it to operate with stuff like the environment, which is an abstract concept in many ways, and so we feel nothing about that. We just know we should feel more. It sounds very simple to say that you don't feel accurately about things that you haven't seen firsthand or you haven't experienced firsthand, but it's the same as not being able to see the color blue or not being able to see straight lines. If abattoirs had glass walls, we'd all be vegetarian. I know that's hyperbole. Plenty of people have been in an abattoir and still eat meat, but you get the vibe of that we feel differently about things we've seen or encountered firsthand to things that we have simply imagined. And we're fooled again into thinking that our emotions can signal accurately to us about imagined concepts because we can get such a clear visual and conceptual sense of things we've never experienced. But we can't get an emotional sense of those things. That's the point. And that is disastrous because we do act emotionally about the world. We do act emotionally even though we may not admit that to ourselves. So it's vital to have an accurate emotional apprehension of stuff you can't see, to operate functionally within the modern world, because so much of what we do relates to things that are remote. The reason every religion in history that has lasted anyway, has been created, I would assert, is because of this. It tells us this thing in different ways, and then it gives us very different strategies for coping with this thing. And you'll notice I'm not even going to talk about God, because some religions have God as part of the way of coping with this, and others, like Buddhism, don't. And I'm not going to work out whether there's a God or not in a YouTube video, but I'm just looking at what they're telling us about this problem that secular society doesn't even know is a thing. Now, some parts of secular society are aware it's a thing, like psychology, for example. And again, the frustrating thing is psychologists don't have a proper emotional apprehension of the scale of it, because they don't feel much about understanding where our emotions fall short, because it's an abstract concept. We haven't evolved the ability to feel emotions about abstract concepts like that. So the very thing that stops them declaring a global emergency the way religions do is the problem itself. They don't feel emotionally enough to say, oh my God, Do something every single day of your life to remind yourself you're imperfect. If you don't, you're going to die out. That's what all religions do. Like, do something every day. Keep this in your mind all the time. We're impaired. We're imperfect. We're in a state of sin. We're confused. Do something. Science doesn't bother, even though it probably understands exactly what's going on. So an atheist might say to you, you don't need religion to know what's right and wrong, because if you teach a society cause and effect, why violence is bad, why greed is bad, why adultery causes problems, then that society can regulate its behavior for the right reasons, and it will be a much more ethical way of doing things than just doing the right thing because you're afraid of God's wrath. That's just self-preservation. Well, engaging in a meditation on why things are bad, that is like the start of a religion. It's like an understanding that you don't physically feel right and wrong enough to do the right thing. So the first step is to study it, and then you'll be better able to tell your own body you should feel bad about this. It wasn't instinctive, but now that you understand it, you should feel bad. So that's like the start of a religion. And what I'm saying is it's not a strong enough way of regulating your physiology to really work. So there could be secular versions of this, like the state, for instance, is a secular version of self-regulation. But the problem is laws and policing have to be constantly updated in accordance with the changing infrastructure of society. And I think the things that will be most resilient in guiding us are those things that are absolute and remain something you can follow no matter what happens to society's image. So the 7 deadly sins, you can relate them to the society in which they were written and the modern world, because they've been written in a way that's absolute. But the law has to pertain to aspects of the modern world that are the product of our impaired judgment. So if you've got something that's evolving alongside the thing that's the problem, it's less resilient. Anyway, in practice, simply knowing that you should be moral just doesn't seem to be working. I mean, let's look at a couple of examples where the environment has moved too fast for us to feel correctly driven towards the right behavior to keep us healthy. And I would say processed food is one of those things. It's quite a new phenomenon. Because it's artificial, it doesn't speak the same chemical language as our appetite. And so whereas fruits and vegetables send chemical signals to provide satiety at the appropriate moment when you've eaten enough, processed food doesn't do that, so it keeps you eating beyond your calorific need. That doesn't sound like a moral issue, but the reason that gluttony is in the list of 7 deadly sins, for example, is because it's about not injuring your health. We think as intellectual creatures we're going to be able to follow what we know is reason and logic and employ willpower when it comes to food. Well, the reality is we don't. Look at the scale of our health problems. 8 of the top 10 killers in the West are related to diet, and more people are overweight than are healthy weight in the West. I know it's an emotive issue, but I'm saying it's not really our fault because willpower doesn't seem to work enough. Another example is adultery. It's something we've decided that we don't like as a society, and there are different acquisitive deals that we make with each other, whether it's monogamy or polygamy, but we seem to want to make deals with each other. And yet we don't act on those deals because pornography dominates the internet. Prostitution is the oldest profession. And there's an ideal here that we say we want, but then it seems our wiring pulls us in a different direction. And you don't need to fully believe this right now because we'll return to it. But as you might have inferred already, what I'm saying is that morality always pertains to artifice, because for anything natural, you have an instinct attached that guides your behavior correctly, because the natural world that we interacted with evolved at the same pace as the body. What's so confusing about this, which I really believe is true, that morality always pertains to artifice, is that so much of how we interact with reality is half natural, half false. Sex and food are natural. There are many instances, though, where you interact with them in an unnatural way. I was talking about monogamy there. Sex is natural, but, to some extent, being faithful isn't, because it wasn't something we did in the trees. We didn't have pair bonding when we were in the trees. However, since moving to the savannah, it's been bred into our genetics because it did confer this adaptive advantage. If a child had two parents looking after it, now on the savannah, you were in the way of all these predators. The children survived more, and people with a tendency to want monogamy were the ones who survived. But because it's still a sort of new thing that we've done, it doesn't go back to when we lived in the trees. Even though it's very old, it's still sufficiently new for there to be a margin of biological error, as the circuitry we have for emotional signaling still sometimes throws up an archaic desire to sleep with some passing person. I mean, it's more complex than that, because there's also an advantage to promiscuity, I guess. It means more people come about. But I think you get what I'm saying. Like, with any moral issue, the presence of that moral is an indication this is not something that we would have done in the rainforest. It's an intellectual bridge that's had to be built because there's something missing in the biological circuitry relating to this. Religion understands it as the price of civilization, the price of being human in a man-made environment. And it reminds us of it with concepts like, if I'm talking about Christianity because Christianity doesn't mind us talking about it, but and in the next video I'll talk about Buddhism. But in Christianity, it's called original sin. It's set out in the story of Adam and Eve. We moved from a state of symbiosis when we fell from nature's grace, or the state that all the other animals are in, where they can act primarily on instinct, and somehow the environment and their natural behavior keeps them safe, or safe enough to procreate and keep going as a species. So we fell from nature's grace when we moved out of the trees. And I would suggest this was a forced move, because it would be very unlikely for a group of animals to just move into a hostile environment and take their children. It seems to be the result of environmental failure, like the trees becoming swamped by a flood and not bearing fruit anymore, and us having to find a way out of it. Anyway, so we moved from the state of grace into a state of sufficient knowingness that we were able to self-sustain in a hostile environment. And this knowingness is called forbidden knowledge in the story of Adam and Eve. Why is it forbidden? Because if you're perceptually impaired by your biological signaling falling behind the false environment that you then have to create around you, unless you become aware of that problem and devise a strategy for mitigating against it, your loss of emotional acuity, which is perceptual acuity, means you end up destroying the natural world that supports you. So you end up destroying the natural world and yourself. Again, I'll suggest that every religion gets this. And modern science and academia, they might know it intellectually, but they don't know it emotionally, of course, so they don't really get it. In the story of Christ's crucifixion, Christ is a version of ourselves whose instincts work. They lead him to do the right thing without thinking about it, so he'll even lose his own life to do the right thing. That probably can't be said for the rest of us. But for us to live as technological creatures, with this issue that technology equals unwitting sin through impaired perception, and that equals the destruction of our environment and in turn the destruction of us, we would have to say, okay, we're going to live on, and that means we're sinners. We would have to admit that total morality, which would dictate we killed ourselves, is at odds with us moving forward. For our society that relies on imperfection to exist, we have to kill the good version of ourselves. That's the sacrifice that is required. Now, as I've said in many other videos on this channel, becoming technological, I don't think, was a choice we made. You can see our move from the savannah was a very rapid one and a forced one. If it had been slower, our bodies would have adapted to the landscape of the savannah. We would have evolved things like teeth, claws. We'd be able to hunt for food without tools. We would have had night vision, a good sense of smell to avoid predators. We would have been able to digest grasses and root vegetables without having to cook them, and raw meat without having to kill the pathogens through fire and all that. The appearance of tools indicates our environment changed so quickly we were in a tight spot and had to innovate to survive. And it forced us into creating this technological buffer to do that. we also had the problem of not having instincts that informed us about the environment around us, because our instincts were shaped in the trees. So they didn't give us a feeling of repulsion, of fear towards the things that could kill us, like new exotic poisonous plants. Whereas we had an instinct to recoil from things that could kill us in the trees, spiders and snakes, because it was the trees that shaped our physiology, no instinct would have existed to tell us that this plant is potentially lethal. And I would suggest this created the need for us to use the existing linguistic circuitry we had that was present in the brain for instinctive elements of language like crying, laughing, and screaming, to create new novel symbolic mouth noises with which to collaboratively catalogue the items of novelty around us. So this was what invoked the invention of language. We had to create an intellectual bridge that filled the gap between where our biological signalling would ideally be if it was going to regulate our behaviour appropriately, and where it actually was, because it had never had time to evolve on the savannah. So no other animal needs made-up language that I know of. But we do, because we are faced with this problem. And I would argue that the intelligence required to overcome this in the way we did was the result of our fruit-based diet. If you read the work of Tony Wright, he explains the mechanism by which the brain suddenly tripled in size in a very unusual way that we haven't seen elsewhere in nature that we know of. And it gave us this intelligence that allowed us to innovate our way through the difficult descent from the trees, the expulsion from the state of nature's grace. And then, funnily enough, it's symbolized in the story of Adam and Eve as an apple of knowledge, or the tree of knowledge. Anyway, as I've said, to move forward in this state where you're innovating tools and intellectual bridges that work to keep you alive, but simultaneously impair your ability to see the destruction you're causing, it means you have to move forward in a state of unwitting sin. There's slightly more complexity about the nature of our idiocy, but I'll go into that in the next video. So it's not just this that makes us stupid, it's something else as well. But I hope this sheds light on the weirdness of the crucifixion story and the confusion within that basically bad triumphs over good. We have to kill the good version of ourselves. The result being we get to live on. This is the explanation. You could say the story is not metaphorical, it actually happened. Christ is a historical figure, and maybe there was someone called Christ who was. But I think it's a metaphorical story because that same thing has occurred through many different religions many times before the crucifixion story of 2,000 years ago. So I hope you don't mind me repeating the same message over and over again in this video. We are at odds with the Christ-like consciousness of total morality. If we'd have been enlightened and made the moral choice about whether to live on as a species, morally, we would choose to die out. Now, that's not completely damning to us because, as it says in the Bible, it's the force of love that made us want to live on. God so loved the world that he sacrificed his only son that humans may live, or something like that. That's pretty much it. And it's love for our fellow humans that keeps us wanting to stay alive. We don't even think about it intellectually. It's just we're driven through love to want to survive. And you know what? This great problem that faces us, the sinner's compromise that we've chosen in order to endure, knowingly or unknowingly at the time, although it seems our ancestors knew all about it, this could be one of many great existential crises that faces many different species throughout the cosmos routinely and unremarkably. And by the way, the reason that our ancestors probably knew about it in a way that we don't is because religion starts from the whole and works its way down to the human as a flawed part of the whole. So it's just a more accurate perspective, whereas science has no choice but to work from us as the center of the universe and start to catalogue what it can decode outwards. And it's not in a good position to see things from an accurate perspective. So you get incredibly intelligent academics who are oblivious to this. There could be a solution to this, which would obviously rely on us recognizing the problem in the first place. But a resolution is hinted at in many of these religions. Like in Christianity, it says God or Christ will return. There'll be a second coming. And if the Christ-like consciousness is a metaphor for us having the ability to see and feel morally in a way that's natural, maybe, this is hinting at some kind of return to a functional acuity about what exists and how we should feel about it, in a way that in the Bible says will grant us eternal life, but that could be a metaphor for just being able to have future generations survive. So this could be a blip in our progress through different states of intelligence. And Christianity's device for mitigation against immorality is to instill in you a biological deterrent through conditioning that uses your existing emotional infrastructure in combination with the conceptual device of God fear, so that the emotional infrastructure can signal to you not to do certain things that will help you stay healthy and basically help you navigate your way through an increasingly false cultural environment that encourages you to do things that will make you unhealthy and potentially kill you. So God fear physically scares you into doing the right thing. It tells you the morals that it wants you to follow, and it starts that secular process of having you meditate on why things are bad intellectually, but then it helps you physically to feel viscerally you don't want to do certain things by making you think you're going to go to hell if you do. Now, I'm not disputing maybe there is a hell. I've always thought, what would be the point? It's such a waste of resources because you don't get out of it. Like, to what end do you go to hell? But anyway, I can't know whether this is literally true or not, but I'm suggesting it's a metaphor that you can see is functional because it physically coerces you into doing the right thing. So that's how Christianity works. It's a conservative religion. It's committed to the technological enterprise. Since technology did keep us alive when we moved to the savannah, yes, it's the source of our sin, but it's the source of our being able to survive, two sides of the same coin. So its story of Christ's crucifixion makes its peace with this sinner's compromise incredibly well without flinching for a moment from how awful the compromise is. Incredibly advanced self-awareness there, but it says that to live within this society, let's simply accept that we're screwed, we're sinners, we're imperfect, let's simply accept that. We'll reinforce that with a bunch of visions of what hell's like if you do the wrong thing, and you won't even feel like sinning anymore. All the best. And yes, that's a source of tremendous trauma, but at the same time, I can't imagine what else would stop me from eating loads of biscuits, honestly. I mean, what else but fear of eternal damnation is capable of holding back the avalanche of filth on the internet? Not many things. Buddhism, on the other hand, takes a very different approach to what to do about our impairment. It's not a conservative religion, I wouldn't say. It doesn't tell you, let's just walk further into the maze of technology with this list of sins that if we follow, we'll stay fairly healthy. In time, you'll forget why these things are sins, but, just keep following them and hope the maze doesn't get too confusing. Buddhism says that our answer to navigating the maze is to just come out the maze for a minute. Just come over here, mate. Come over here, sit down and meditate for 30 years. And unfortunately, that means you won't have time to become a computer programmer. But look, this is a good thing to do with your life. If you're genuinely committed to this, you probably won't have time to worry about things like attachment to people. But none of that's working for humanity anyway. So just meditate, Buddhism's answer is to recognize the brain isn't working, it doesn't apprehend reality properly, and like I said, there are more problems than what I've covered in this video. The problem with the brain is complex, and Buddhism says, well, don't just write down a bunch of rules and wing it. Sign up to engaging in these physical practices that, if you do them for decades, will literally unscramble your brain into a more acute way of understanding reality, and then you'll reach a state of enlightenment perhaps. But even if you don't reach that, you'll just be able to function in a way that's operational. And in a way, you become a Christ-like figure then. You do the right thing because you're seeing what is. And in Christianity, the only way to God is through Christ, I think it's implying a similar thing. The only way to reconnect with nirvana, to reconnect with nature or a state of grace, is to make your brain Christ-like. And Buddhism says we've got a handbook on doing that, or several different versions of this handbook. And so it's insight into the nature of what's impaired about our perception. If you read a lot of different Buddhist texts, far transcends modern psychology and modern science, if you believe it, which I do. So Buddhism's answer is something I'll go into in part 2 of this exciting series. Please share your comments below and share this video with people who are very opinionated so that it is exposed to the best and most acute criticism against it available. And I'll see you next time.